such as the Institute of Social Studies Trust, SEVA, and the Center for Policy Research, focusing on gender and labor issues. With her academic background in development economics from Delhi University and Harvard Kennedy School, Shayana has an extensive knowledge base and expertise in the field of economics. She is known for her insightful research and analysis on social and economic development issues in India and other developing countries. In addition to her remarkable contributions to the world of economics, Shayana is also a gifted author. Her first book of non-fiction, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence, was published in November 2021 by HarperCollins India and later by Liberty Books in Pakistan in August 2022. This insightful work explores the experiences of young Indian women in their search for independence and intimacy, highlighting the challenges they face in a complex and patriarchal society. Shayana's dedication to her work and outstanding achievements have been recognized through various awards and accolades. She recently won the Arta Galata BLF Book Prize for Best Nonfiction for 2022, the Times of India JK Paper Author Prize for Best Nonfiction Author for 2022, and the SKOCH Economic Forum Prize for Literature. I would also like to introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Nishika Bhatia is an assistant professor and assistant dean of international strategy at Jindal School of Banking and Finance. She's a mathematician by training and has completed her PhD in operations research and management science at the Warwick Business School, University of Warwick in the UK. Her research interests are supply chain management, pricing, and inventory management. She teaches courses on statistics, spreadsheets, optimization, and pricing analytics. She is a Shahrukh Khan fan and loves to read. Professor Nimisha Bora is a lecturer and heads the Office of Industry Interface at Jindal School of Banking and Finance. She's done her PhD from Xavier's Institute of Management, where she tried to examine the nuances of financial reporting quality. Professor Nimisha is a faculty in the area of accounting and teaches subjects like management accounting, forensic accounting, financial reporting. Apart from her academic interests, she is a big Shahrukh Khan fan and has grown up reading Mills and Boons and fantasizing about old school love. I would like to welcome Shayana Bhattacharya. If you could please grace the stage with your presence. It is now my privilege to finally introduce to you the book, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence by Shayana Bhattacharya. This book is a powerful and thought-provoking exploration of the challenges that young women in India face as they navigate the complex terrain of love, relationships, and societal expectations. A friend of mine recommended this book to me last year, and if there is one word that I would have to use to describe this book, it is therapeutic. It was therapeutic to read that it is not my expectations that are so high, but it is the unequal playing field of the market of love that leaves me feeling dissatisfied. It was relieving to revel and take part in the female gaze as I read about women from a variety of backgrounds, with Khan being the one constant that unites us all. That unites us all in our desire to be uplifted from the monotony of everyday life and the disappointments that we all experience. She draws upon her own experiences as young women in India and her extensive research to shed light on the struggles of Indian women who are seeking both intimacy and independence in a society that often fails to provide either. Through a series of insightful interviews with young women from diverse backgrounds, she illuminates the hopes, fears, and aspirations of these women as they strive to carry out their own paths in life. This book has sparked multiple conversations between me and my male friend as we dissected it. Me, as I confessed just how relatable it was to me as a woman, and my male friend who outlined his anxiety of escaping the inevitability of being a man. At the heart of I read the last segment of the book, and the only way I can describe it is as the ending of a symphony with a perfect crescendo. Every theme taken from the stories of the women we've just read about is tied in with economics, as I came to the debilitating realization that love in fact does make us all economists. We are all calculating and deliberating in love. And as someone who's not from an economics background, I now find myself using cost-benefit analysis whenever I take any decision in my personal professional life, accounting for trade-offs and opportunity costs. Shayana's writing is insightful, powerful, and deeply compassionate. Her book is a must-read for anyone who is interested in understanding the lives of women in India and the broader struggle for gender equality around the world. It is a book that will challenge you, inspire you, and leave you with a profound understanding of the complex issues facing women in India and beyond. Thank you so much.
Shall we start? I think we can start, right? How do we switch this on? Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome and a very warm welcome to Shreyana and everyone here. We've been anticipating this for a very long time, and honestly, I'll just speak a little bit about the book and then I'll just pass it on to Shreyana. We've all been waiting from here to. I'm a little nervous, I'll be honest. I'm a big fan of the book. Okay, honestly, I'm thrilled to have this conversation because this book has been deeply personal and it has been very influential for me. The book uses two of my favorites, Data and Shahrukh Khan, to study women, their economic conditions, their independence, their loneliness, their solitude, the female sisterhood, feminism, and most important of all, love. It is certainly a remarkable piece of work which has the power to make you think, unlearn and relearn some very important lessons. It is also refreshingly very funny. I must admit that I have been guilty of laughing at public spaces, and people think I'm mad laughing at a book on economics. However, it can also make you sad and extremely furious at times because of the upsetting statistics and the gut-wrenching anecdotes of the women discussed in the book. But at the same time, it also offers hope. It offers comfort and support. Because for me, it felt like someone was giving me a hug and telling me that it's all okay. You're not alone in this. So it's truly a labor of love, Shreyana, and I cannot thank you enough for it. A very warm welcome again. A big round of applause for the women of the hour, Shreyana Bhattacharya.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. The first question, I want to start with, I think everybody's favorite, Shahrukh Khan. I believe it is well known that the book is actually not about Shahrukh Khan. He's used as a research tool to study and discover, as she calls it, the intimate revolutions of Indian women. So how did you come up with such a brilliant idea, Shreyana?
Firstly, let me just thank you, everyone. I know everyone has so many things to be, you're busy, there are, classes going on. So I really just appreciate everyone who's made the time. I want to thank the two of you. I couldn't come earlier because I genuinely was just flat out ill. So I really just want to thank you for your patience and for inviting me again, and to everyone who's helped just organize and put this together. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time on campus. I want to start by telling you that, now in retrospect, 15 years later, the book is out. It has been more than 15 years since the research of the book started. If I tell you a story, it'll make sense, right? And so in retrospect, everything sounds like it's perfectly coherent. But when I was doing it, it was not. So I'm very touched and moved by so many of the things I've heard, and I think through the course of the book. But honestly, while I was writing it and while I was having these conversations, it was never particularly clear to me. There was no clear research framework. I was almost just having conversations on the fly. And I've always been one of those people who diligently takes notes and journals everything they hear and see every day. And I have a decent memory, and I'm good at transcribing and sending things back to people and forcing them to say, well, did you say this and is it okay? But where it started was in 2006. For those who haven't read the book, I'm going to sort of tell you some origin story of the book. In 2006, I just finished a master's in economics, and I was full of this hubris of data, right? So I thought I was going to go do a bunch of surveys, and these surveys would just solve every problem that so many of the people that we were surveying had. And I was sent as a research assistant. I was working for a small feminist think tank called the Institute of Social Studies Trust. And we had a project with SEVA, which I think many of you will know is one of the world's largest labor unions for informal working women. I was sent to a neighborhood called Bapu Nagar in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad. And I was just supposed to, they gave me a questionnaire, and my job was to help administer this questionnaire. I started, and it was a very traditional economic questionnaire on labor rights, access to wages, hours of work, working conditions. And as I started to ask the questions, and the women I was asking these questions to were typically home-based workers. They were making incense sticks or garments at home, earning about a quarter of minimum wage. And as I started to ask, I could tell that they looked so bored. It was just so evident that this whole process was too was repeated too many times. And I'm one of these people, I'm very sensitive to when I'm boring you. So I keep saying this, if I'm boring any of you, you should raise your hand and we'll try and do things differently. I don't want to bore people. And I realized, okay, this is not working, so what do we do? And in social sciences, you're taught, you use different methods. There are few things in common that you can talk to people about. I started asking all these women through what I call a research recess about their favorite actor. And I was surprised to find, because I was always told that Mr. Khan's fan base was urban, elite, fairly metropolitan, people like me. And suddenly I saw that these women who were struggling to make, daily wages and were fighting for labor rights every day loved him. And when they started to talk about him, it became very clear as a researcher that the tone, the tenor, the texture of the conversations just opened up. There was this energy, the energy that you have when you talk about just wages and hours of work, it was not the same. And I think something shifted in me. I was very young. I mean, I was in my early 20s at that point of time. And I think I decided that instead of doing the traditional work of the survey, I mean, I would do it because I had to do it, but I would start to have this different conversation. And I started asking all these women about Shahrukh, about, well, what does he mean to you? When did you see him? Why do you like him? What's going on? And one of the women told me, it was after I think the first 3 or 4 days of these kinds of conversations in Bapu Nagar, she actually said to me, she said, often, they used to call me Survey Wali Didi. And they'd say, Survey Wali Didi aati hai, and then they only ask you about Narega. Well, not in urban areas, but they'll ask you, this is something I heard in rural areas, they'll ask you about Narega, they'll ask you about pension, they'll ask you about schemes. Nobody has ever asked me about my favorite actor. And I realized there was something really interesting going on. And as I started to look at the notes slowly and steadily, because I used this technique then from the slums of Ahmedabad to the forests of Jharkhand, villages of Uttar Pradesh, different places where I went for these research projects on women and labor. Everywhere I met Shahrukh fans. There were a few women who didn't like him, and that was fine, but I was very interested in talking to the women who were fans to understand what was going on. And when I looked at the first year of notes, it was very clear to me that they were not talking about a celebrity. They were actually talking about how much these women struggle to just find purchasing power, access to markets, access to free time, just to be able to watch a cinema star. And I realized there was something interesting about, in economics, we're always using proxies for things, right? When we want to measure things well. And I thought, well, how interesting if I started to think about using access to your favorite movie icon as a proxy for economic freedom, as a proxy for purchasing power, as a proxy for how easy is it for you to access markets, interact freely with markets. Because to watch your favorite actor, you need money, you certainly need free time, you need access perhaps to a mobile phone increasingly, you need access to a screen, and you realize these heartbreaking stories that are in the book, which end up, I think, being quite hopeful. They start fairly, I think they crushed me when I was listening to this, which is it's so bloody hard to just be able to watch Shahrukh Khan. And I realized from that energy, I think, that I derived from those initial round of conversations that I wanted to follow this further. And then I just continued. So many of the women I met initially didn't really want to continue talking to me, and there were some who did. So there's a set of around 8 to 10 women who have been privileged to follow for, it's longitudinal, it's now coming up to be 12 to 15 years. And essentially every year our conversation was, did you watch Shahrukh? What happened? Did you like him? And slowly I realized while the initial part was about the economy, steadily into sort of the first 5 years then of notes, I realized suddenly this man was now being used and invoked to talk about masculinity, because everywhere, and you see this in the book, everywhere women were articulating, I think at least the women who were speaking to me were articulating love as a lever in the economy. And one's intimate life and one's economic life is far more intertwined than I think social scientists would like us to believe, especially the male ones. And I think I started just lean into these conversations, and that's how it happened. But when I tell you this, I realize it sounds really linear and it all makes sense, but when I was doing this, it didn't. It's just rigorous note-taking, which sounds really boring and banal, but trust me, there's such power to it. And then when you take a step back and you start to actually read and engage with the themes that are popping up, it became very clear to me that suddenly these women were all using Shahrukh Khan to talk about themselves. They were not talking about him. They were talking about their own economic access, their own access to romantic freedom and personal freedom. And that's the genesis of the book.
Oh, that's lovely. That's so because you talk about note-taking, the book here has been there's color coded, and I realized it has nothing to do with my research or my work, but and because of this, I picked up some more books and I tried to find common themes. So I understand. I'm also fond of it. Sometimes, you know, when you're doing it, you feel, oh, there's no point of doing this. Nothing's going to happen. But it does lead to interesting stuff.
You know, one thing I do want to say, and I'm sorry if I'm going to antagonize many of the men on faculty here, but I feel like there is a way in which the social sciences are architected, which has been, it continues to be a fairly masculine gaze. And even women who do tend to do well in that world have adopted, and all of us do it. I mean, I think in my regular job at the World Bank, I'm sure I show up with a fairly masculine set of traits. Some of it can be useful, but some of it is not. And I think in the social sciences, we've somehow convinced ourselves that the economy has nothing to do with sentiment unless it's sort of in this minute behavioral economics way where I sort of start doing psychometric tests. And that feelings and sentiments are somehow to be disregarded when it comes to rigorous work on society and the economy. If you look at like the big books that tend to do well in nonfiction in India, it's basically military history. It's history of like big strong men. It's always men worshipping men, and I'm tired of it. And I thought how interesting it would be to talk about a man who is worshipped, but actually invert the gaze completely. And I remember when I was embarking on writing this, many feminists who I really admire told me, well, it's great you want to sort of approach the book this way, but you will alienate essentially the core reader of nonfiction that tends to be a straight man. And I said to hell with it, because I wanted to write it precisely actually for the reaction that you and the lady who introduced us, thank you, had. I wanted the book to sort of put out another layer and way of looking at the social sciences that I think sociologists and anthropologists and people who are not perhaps in somewhat very different fields look at, but do it in a way which is also honorable and does justice to the economy and to economics, but to wed the two. And I knew it was a risk, but it was a risk I really wanted to take because I was really tired of this very pavam way of writing social science. And I didn't want to do it. How can you talk about the economy without talking about sex? How can you talk about these, all these everyday interactions have so much to do with our intimacy. And I wanted to at least play around with those boundaries and see what happens. And so it's an effort, I think, along with so many other women and sort of, people who don't conform perhaps to that very masculine ideal of the social sciences, to try and write a different kind of nonfiction and do a different kind of social science. So, yeah.
Thank you for doing that. I have two questions related to that, but I'm going to ask for the first one. And just to add on to that, I must say that I was just telling her when she came that I think at least 2 or 3 men have come to me and said that, the book made me uncomfortable. And that was nice to hear. But okay, going back to the question, and this is something I think Nimisha also will add something to it because she was talking about it, that there seems to be a pattern in the book, and I'm not from the social sciences, so I could be, maybe this is new for me, where you narrate an often relatable anecdote, with the stories, which are lovely, which engages the reader immediately for the book. And gradually, the story seems fine, it's really nice to read, and then it enters into this important and serious discussion, which is suddenly backed by very hard data, which is often depressing to read. I think it's a very engaging style of writing, and I would love for you to tell us more about it. Yeah. And I think Nimisha would also like to add that we've experienced a similar thing while teaching.
So both Nishika and I deal with a lot of data when we're talking, teaching in the class. Me, accounting data, and Nishika, stats and all of that. But it's a challenge that we face, when we are, as I already told you, the attention span of students is very, very less. We are trying to engage them and tell them or weave a story, but many a times we are constrained by the, subject matter and all of that we cannot come down to that level and, weave a story around the numbers that we have. Ultimately, we do have to stick to the technicality of the subject. So we would like to know more about it, because your book was an eye-opener for both of us. We have been discussing that, and we said, can we bring Shahrukh to the classroom, and I can talk about my accounting financial statements, and Nishika can do the same. Yeah. But we have not been able to do it the way you have done it, for sure.
Thank you.
So, yes,
yeah, thank you. So, more than perhaps bringing Shahrukh, maybe you could start with bringing Jean Dress to the classroom. I mean, just, show a few op-eds and then use that to have a conversation about welfare economics. But, this goes back, I think, to this idea when I was doing research for the book, because I think this is true for anyone who's ever done primary fieldwork. How many people here have ever just gone out and asked strangers questions? Yeah, so all of you who raised your hands will have a sense of what I'm talking about, which is that the energy of that is always very playful. Either it can be very dangerous, it can be very uncomfortable, but it can also, after a while, if you actually manage to have a conversation with a stranger, it is quite playful. And I think typically what tends to happen, at least in the field of econ, is that we kind of remove all that because that's not supposed to be the sum and substance of what you're supposed to do, and I can understand that to some extent. But to me, actually, it was all the detritus of the research process that was really interesting, right? Because these women were telling me about how many hours they were working to buy a ticket for a Shahrukh film. That's actually what they were doing. They were telling me, oh, if I work so many days, if I save so much, I can eventually watch a film, I can get a bus to go here, or I can organize a screening. So I ended up capturing almost the same variable, but I wanted the reader to really understand the effort and the sort of emotional content behind what was going on. And to me, that it is a slightly much more, I think it's a more pleasure-oriented sort of, ethos of looking at research. And I think if we can be more playful and not take ourselves so seriously, right, especially as those who teach, rigor does not mean self-seriousness. I think there's I at least when I think of those who taught me economics and the people who taught me economics and those who I really remember and learned from were people who were somewhat light in touch, because they were able to explain the theory to you, but it came alive. And economics is everywhere. I mean, for those of you who aren't students, I mean, it's our everyday, day-to-day interactions. It's essentially that codes all of that. And so to me, the writing style, it was very important that I wanted to bring that playfulness into the way I was writing. I almost had this image of, I won't name names, but I had images of certain very conservative men I know, and I wanted them to blush when they would read the book, like feel uncomfortable or close it and run away. And I wrote it very much from that perspective, which is I wanted it to be as honest and as authentic to the art, to the playfulness in our genuine conversations, and not make it sanitized and not sort of, keep it really safe and, so that people feel comfortable. I wanted to provoke a certain kind of discomfort. Having said that, I think what really helped me also was that I'm madly in love with Shahrukh Khan. And what that did is that I had two sort of target readers in mind. So of course I had, this image of this like uncle who I wanted to really irritate with this book. But I also had the image of him reading it. And I wanted it to be accessible to somebody who perhaps knew a little bit of economics but was not completely well-versed in that world. And I wanted it to be as alive and engaging for someone who doesn't come from the field. And the other person I wrote it for, actually to me, I think the reason I ended up with that style is him, the uncle, and my grandmom. My grandmother used to be surrounded by a lot of Bengali men, and most Bengali men end up being economists, especially upper caste ones. And she used to always complain, why is it that all these guys, like they write about the economy, but they write about it in such a way that I can just never understand it. And I wrote it very much. She passed away around the time that I think I was midway through the research. And I think I wrote it very much with her also looming in my head. So I think I don't have like a technical answer for you as to how do you achieve this balance. I think each one of us, as we go along, we will reach that balance if you want to introduce that playfulness in the way you think about and explore the world and write about it. But to me, what really helped was having a reader in mind. A reader you want to irritate, a reader you want to sort of convey something to, a reader who sort of provokes you into sort of thinking about how the style should sit. And the last thing I will say is I really just wanted to be authentic to the conversations. And remember, every year I was transcribing, and this was going back. And many of the women I interviewed don't read English or Hindi, so I had to do narration. I mean, like the joke is that the OTT version of this book is available because it's like written in script form, which is being constantly narrated. And there was such joy in those conversations because it was giggles and laughter and also a lot of sadness sometimes. And I just wanted the stories and the way I was recording it in the book for it to be absolutely authentic and honor those experiences. So I think keep your reader in mind and also try and be as authentic as you can within the rules of anonymity, keeping the people you're writing about secure, but be as authentic as possible.
Thank you. Following that question as well, In various academic texts, the authors extensively write about the research subjects. You know, like you said, in ensuring anonymity and following all the research ethics. But they rarely write about their own experiences, even if the research is related to their lives. That doesn't happen in your book because the initial chapters are about your own personal experiences, and you're unapologetic about it. You know, it just feels like you're talking to a friend. And then, you know, you talk about the various wonderful women, and I want to name them because I'm inspired by all of them. That is Vidya, the accountant, Gold, Zahrina, Meenal, Manju, Lily, and Vibha. So what pushed you to narrate your own story along with the women of the book? And was it difficult or easy for you to do that?
No, it was not easy at all. But I'll come to that in a second. I can't write any other way. Anything, I think everyone has a style of writing. For me, I've always, remember, because the book is born out of journal entries and diary notes and conversations, I don't have another style of writing. I don't even know how people do that. I have two styles of writing. One, in my World Bank job, I have there's a very, very clear way in which a technocrat is supposed to write. So I have that style of writing. And then I have another style of writing, which is this. I can't even imagine how you write in an impersonal way stories that are so personal. Maybe if I were doing archival work and it was very different, perhaps the language would be different, but that's not my area of work. The other thing that I was very clear about is I had the privilege of working under the mentorship of some phenomenal activists and feminists who at a very early stage when I was doing this, you know, told me, and I mentioned this in the book, that, you know, every day there are girls with, you know, kajal in their eyes and wearing khadi kurta going and asking questions for a research project. There has to be reciprocity in that process. The research space is so unequal, especially between those doing the research and those being observed, that perhaps that flatness can never really be achieved in the world that we currently live in. But perhaps what we can do is introduce yourself in some modicum of more, you know, going back to that whole notion of authenticity. And so I had a rule that I would only write about things about others that I would write about myself. So if I wrote about someone else's personal life and sex life, I would mention mine as well. And it just so happened that I think in my own personal life, I wish a terrible love affair for all of you. Like, each one of you should have one terrible one that, you know, you can, like, it's great material. And I had one, and it was terrific material. What was difficult was, you know, I had to share it with people involved and make sure that they were comfortable. And there were things that I had to sort of edit out and things that I had to be very, very cognizant of, because you can't write things like this without taking other people's feelings into account. So to me, I think it was a combination of, you know, having a story to tell, and also this guidance that I got, I think, at a fairly young age about this notion of reciprocity, at least to introduce it in the text. But, you know, the challenge with that, and I really want to sort of talk about this because you see this in the West, and I see it really picking up now, I think in South Asia as well, which is then, you know, keeping a personal form of writing does not mean that that's an excuse for narcissistic self-indulgence, right? So the story is not about you. And I'm very grateful to my editor, Shaugat Dasgupta, and my agent, who's also my PhD guide on this book, to be honest, her name's Shruti Devi. They made sure that anytime I was becoming a little too, because it happens, it's very natural, you know, we're living in a culture which really encourages us to be self-obsessed. So when you start to move down that path, some vision correction and editing correction, a little, you know, slap on your wrist, that would come from these two readers, and I really relied on them for that. So I think that's where that personal style comes from. But I think with the personal style then is the challenge of how do you keep a balance such that, you know, it's not an Instagram post, it's a book, right? And I think you have to sort of keep that in mind when you're thinking about the structure of it. And there you have to rely perhaps on people who will be your readers or your editors to make sure. And, you know, a little bit of honesty sometimes when you read, when there's too much you can, you know things are going a bit wobbly and you have to sort of manage it. Because to me, the book is not about my journeys with these women. The book is about the journeys of these women. I happen to just play the role of someone who's trying to stitch some themes together and has one very funny story to share. And that's it. And you sort of wear that lightly, and you rely a little bit on your editor, perhaps, to flatten things out a bit.
Thank you. And I think it would just, the fact that because you narrated it first, I think the initial stories are yours, and then you talk about these women. It's not like, there's no power dynamics within the book, I believe. It's just, You're one of them.
So
We are one of
yeah,
them.
I disagree. I think that there will always be. I don't think you can do research without recognizing there's huge power imbalances, right? Especially in this kind of work. Right now, for example, I'm trying with the proceedings of the book. We're trying to set up like a fund for fun with Seva. So the idea is, women want to watch a movie, they can do it, and we have like, resources available. But even with that, even with the fact that, I'm introducing the book, the imbalance will never go away because it is a product of living in a very unequal society, right? Like that's just going to be there. But I think what you can do perhaps is, going back to my favorite word of don't be a martyr for it, and don't be, it's not, you do the work that you're supposed to do, you do it with as much diligence and honesty as possible. When people say they don't want to be part of the book, you say no. I had to let go of someone whose story was actually really powerful, but she eventually just did not feel comfortable, and I really didn't want, I really wanted her to be part of the book, but she said no, and you have to respect that. You have to respect these boundaries. You have to do the additional work of sending texts back to people to make sure that they feel comfortable with what's actually being reported and written. When lots of women say we don't want to be identified, you have to write a composite, which is fictional, because you can't, and I'm very transparent about, what I do in the book and the way I write stories. So I think that's what we can do. And so I don't think the power imbalance will ever go, but I think at least if you acknowledge it and you see it for what it is, perhaps then you're being a lot more honest in the way you're showing up in the text.
That makes sense. Okay, so this is related to the book, but it's also a personal observation of mine. A lot of us believe that the impact of patriarchy, regularly reduces over time, or you want to believe that. But I think patriarchy takes sort of a new form every generation. In a way, it could be mutating with time. So what I want to say is, for example, what patriarchy was to my grandmother, my mother, is different to me. There's different shades of patriarchy affecting me. The data and the stories and the women of the book does validate that. What I want to ask is, do you think it will ever end? Will we ever be able to say that, oh, we no longer live in a patriarchal society?
There are some who say that, and I laugh at them. It's quite funny. I find it just ridiculous. I think as long as we have caste, how will we ever not be a patriarchal society, right? Like to me, it's, and I mentioned this in the book, it's, the book is structured around where people are, and the income pyramid is really unsurprising that the income pyramid so completely just replicates the caste pyramid. And so given that caste mandates this kind of obsession and surveillance with sexual purity and women's bodies and women's movement and mobility and time, and you see it's littered through the book. It's not surprising that families are very uncomfortable with women just going out to watch a film and to work, because it's actually interacting with the world outside, which is seen as, a step too far for many. And I think given that world, no, I'll wait for the revolution when it comes to our caste system, and then maybe I'll take a step back. I mean, the world is Bayesian, so you should always update your views. But to me, I think in the context that we inhabit, if we're not post-caste, then how can we be post-patriarchy? What has happened, though, I do agree with you. I think that the shape of the beast is very different in different places. And you see that in the book, depending on where you are on the class pyramid, where you are regionally, where you're seated. But to me, what was fascinating, though, is that actually the conversations that will push norms a bit further finally end up being very similar across. So if you look at what's happening in the book, I call these intimate revolutions, the idea that, social change is intimate, it's incremental. You can have the best laws, the best innovations, but women will barely access them, and families and loved ones are not supportive, right, of some of these ideas and norms. And you see this in the book. There are job opportunities, but women aren't accessing them, even if there's subsidy for their transport, or even if there's like other kinds of innovations, largely because families make them feel so unloved for actually pursuing professional ambitions at the altar of conformity. And I think in that world, what you realize is you could be a woman in rural Rampur, or you could be a woman in urban Jorbagh. The difficult conversation that needs to be had with your husband, with your partner, with your daughter, with your mother, which actually is, to me, the seed for social change. The root of that is still the family, right? And so that stays the same. So while the beast is different, but I think the resolution sits in these very difficult conversations that each one of us has to engage in within the home. And the book uses, I mean, for those of you who are econ students, how many econ students here? Actually, just curious. Okay, so I hope you all study something called intra-household bargaining theory at some point. She's shaking her head, and I hope you will. And one of the things that you basically learn is that, you know, economists have spent such elegant, you know, there's such elegant books and papers about this, about how access to assets, be it property, be it cash, be it jobs, suddenly starts to shift power dynamics, and they use game theory to sort of, you know, game this out and model it out. And they basically end up saying that when men have power within the home because you can exit the home. So you will always have power. If you can exit the home, live on your own, public space is designed for you, you will always have power. If women start to have access to property, or if public space starts to be a bit more friendly to women, there might be women who will assert their power within the home to try and exit out, and suddenly dynamics within the home start to change. And the book is rooted in that, like that's the theoretical framework of the book, because basically what I do is I use that theory to explore what's happening within each one of these homes as these women start sort of pushing for access to the world outside more. So the beast is different, but the solution is it's that intra-household dynamic. It's very difficult conversations. And I do believe, I'm one of those people, I do believe jobs and access to property can shift norms, because it can almost provoke, and you see this in the book, it can push people to have these very difficult conversations. Why is it that my brother can work but I can't work, right? You see this constantly across the class pyramid, across the caste pyramid. And I think that's a really important place where we should be thinking of at least studying that much more closely and thinking about what's happening there. Yeah.
Again, you know, adding to this conversation, you have said in the book again and again, I mean, right from Vidya, it's very evident that academically accomplished women find it very difficult to find good men. I mean, I know it's there, it's out there, directly or indirectly.
I actually want to poll, how many people believe this to be true? Just, wow, that's like majority. Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's more than we ourselves accepting it. It's the society who tells us this, that yes, it's somewhere there. I mean, I would not mind quoting my own guide who mentioned this, that, you know, Nimisha, you're doing a PhD. Once you're done with it, if you don't have someone as a, you know, kind of someone who can you rely on, you're planning to get married, it's going to be very difficult to find good men out in the society.
But there are none. That's a different story.
And I was like, okay, at that point of time, maybe I didn't understand, but over a period of time, I do. And when I read your book, again, it was just, you know, deja vu.
Yeah.
So what is your take on that?
So, you know, the last chapter of the book is called Laveria. And one of my favorite economists came up with this idea. I mean, he wrote it, I think, in the context of, this was an op-ed in the New York Times. He wrote it in the context of the US. But one of the things he basically says, he calls it a hidden tax. And he basically says that anytime women start to deviate from what is considered traditional and acceptable, suddenly there are all these emotional taxes that are levied on them, right? This thing that you will not be valued in the marital market. There's a paper which I have all kinds of issues with, so I don't want to get into it, but there's a paper recently doing the rounds about how men don't prefer women with jobs on marriage platforms. It's out right now, anyone can see it. There are all kinds of, if you're just a working woman in the world above the age of, I don't know, 27, you know this, that actually probably even above the age of 25, you know that your accomplishments in the world outside are a tax that men will impose on you, and even women in family circumstances will impose on you in the intimate sphere, right? One of the things you see in the book, and that's actually something that's remarkable to me, is almost all the women in the book say, well, to hell with it, we're willing to bear this tax. We're willing to sort of absorb the value of that tax. It could be loneliness, it could be judgment, it could be isolation. But we are willing to, you know, I say this particularly for a woman who's a runaway from a small town in Rajasthan, and she goes off to live in Gurgaon, and she has a job as an in-flight attendant. And she's the first woman in her family to ever work, speak English, you know, just step out of Rajasthan, period. And she says to me, she says, you know, I could choose safety with my family, but I choose adventure. And if that adventure brings loneliness and it brings this kind of hidden tax, and I think this is true for so many of us probably sitting in this room as well, I choose that. There might be women who will say, I choose the safety. And there are actually cases in the book where you choose adventure, then you go back to safety because you realize the world outside is so hideously difficult for you to occupy. So I think to me, what's really interesting is, we don't, and this goes back to the thing we started with, we don't think the economy is linked to our love lives, right? We like to sort of think that there's sort of these, the economy is for serious people and talking about love is for silly people. It's not. What you realize is love is fundamentally the lever, be it a tax, this hidden tax that I mentioned, be it an incentive, be it a goal, essentially used to constantly surveil and navigate what women will do in the economy, right? Women are performing the labor of love. 66% of our labors are unpaid, 11% of men's labors are unpaid, and that's the labor of love. Love is, as I mentioned, a tax, it's a guide. And to me, I think in the book, what I really wanted people to realize is how much love is actually a factor in women's economic decision-making. And you see it in the book. Almost all the women have to navigate in one way or the other what you're describing in one way or the other. But I take a slightly for at least elite upper caste women who I do think have perhaps the ability to opt out a lot more than those who are dealing with very difficult circumstances when it comes to safety, income, all of that. I do think, I don't know, maybe the solution is you bear the cost of that loneliness. If, for example, you feel the marriage market or the mating market is going to punish you for your achievements, that's fine. I mean, you'll have to bear with it. I often joke, I actually say that I think the sort of the metropolitan elite mating market is like a mix of a Jane Austen novel and a Mad Men episode, from the first season. And actually the women in those novels and those episodes had bone-crushing loneliness, but they had a great time as well. I certainly relate to that. And I think to me, to all the women who are managing that tax and having to deal with that tax, they're my heroes. I mean, you are my hero, and everyone here who's doing that is my hero. And the book is actually in service of that, because often when we talk about feminism and social change, we like this, I call it output feminism. You need to be a CEO, and then we'll put you on a cover and you're like pushing for change. You need to do really remarkable things, and then you're sort of, so it's always sports heroes and heroes. My heroes are women who are actually saying, you know what, I'll be single, or I'll walk out of an unhappy marriage, or I will just navigate the sexual market for adventure. Those are my heroes, and I think that's broadly what I wanted to almost honor. And the book has, it's Shahrukh's tiny picture on the cover, but there's a wallet, and that wallet is actually real. Someone I followed had a wallet, and she used to put a photo of Shahrukh in it. And to me, she's the hero. And I think that's the real root of social change. It's that decision, right? And so I just want to say, I think power to those who are willing to bear the cost of social change, and the cost of social change is loneliness. I think there are many people who are facing it, and it's okay. I think people can still have a great time, as you can see in the book, and certainly I can attest to. But that doesn't mean you need to conform necessarily just to avoid the loneliness. I mean, you can do what gives you more welfare, and that can look very different. But to me, women who are navigating those trade-offs are actually walking this really tight rope of feminism and social change, more than perhaps the people we see on covers and screaming on Twitter.
Thank you. Adding to you guys, my experience is that when I got the PhD admission, which was hard for me to get, my mom, poor thing, took sweets and distributed in her school that, oh, my daughter got a PhD admission. She was excited to share it with her own friends in the school. And these teachers they discouraged her. Why are you celebrating this? Why are you even letting her go? She won't be able to get married. What will you do? So and I'm not going to ask this question because you've answered it already, but I'm just narrating this from a friend who saw the poster, and she immediately sent me some questions she wanted to ask. She's in the US right now. She said, since we are in the marriageable age phase, I'm witnessing a lot of my female friends ready for arranged marriage, not getting suitable guys.
None. That's a whole different story.
Yeah, she also talks about, seems like at least in the urban setting, the women have progressed way faster than men, and the men are unable to catch on to us. So, and that causes a problem. That is
No, we have a very serious crisis of masculinity. I mean, I think for my next book is on middle-aged men, and it's fascinating to me. And I actually feel bad for some of these men, to be perfectly honest, because I think the norms have just changed so much, and young men and middle-aged men, it's a different story altogether, are just not able to handle what has happened, and they're resentful of it. And yet they have tremendous power and control because all our decisions-making systems in the country are run by middle-aged men. And yet they feel strangely that the social norms have sort of outpaced them in a small milieu amongst the upper caste and the elite in particular. But we have a crisis of masculinity. If we just call it what it is, I have no solution for it other than women. I mean, one of the things we mention in the book, and this is, sociologists have been saying this for ages, which is men raised by women who have jobs or access to the world outside the home. It doesn't need to be a paid job. It could just be access to the world outside, tend to produce more progressive men. And the Harvard Business School recently also came out with actually a study which measured these progressive beliefs. There's also a wonderful paper by Tarun Jain and his colleagues where basically they find if you actually socialize and teach kids in school gender attitude, behavior, and correction in playful, fun ways, I think going back to that, right? It seems to have huge effects. And this is like a rigorously peer-reviewed paper and all of that. So I think there are spaces where we can at least acknowledge this crisis of masculinity, acknowledge it amongst the men sitting here. Take a minute, take yourselves out for dinner and ask yourselves that question. And only the straight ones, that's what I meant. I feel like the ones who are not straight have asked themselves far too many questions, and I think we should, and I think to me, I think if we just call it what it is, if you label it, then you can at least start to think about how do you deal with it. And it is a crisis of masculinity. That is why everyone is struggling, and I think it's a really tragic thing, to be honest. I gave the book to Mr. Shahrukh Khan, and I remember it was one thing we actually said, which is it's tragic that this is the state of masculinity amongst particularly the elite and the middle class in our country, that all these women are looking to a superstar who none of us know to essentially create this patchwork of a seemingly acceptable man. I think it tells you something about how deep this crisis is. So to be honest, I'm tired of women being on panels and being asked to talk about gender change. I only want to talk about, why don't we just put 6 men on panels and tell them, why are you not paying women more? Why are you not hiring women more? Why are you taxing women who have PhDs in the marriage market? To me, the complete focus of this has to be upper caste straight men. I mean, that is actually where the problem lies. And then solutions will come, but we have to call the problem what it is.
Okay, I have a few more questions, and then we'll open it to the audience. Towards the end of the book, I think you talk about this Insta-friendly feminism, and the kind who wants to smash the patriarchy on Twitter Pradesh, as you call it, and social media. You say, while the feminism of this class of Indian elite is certainly stylish and loud, you are more drawn towards the dal sabji version of the everyday feminism, which comprises of intimate revolutions, deeply private rebellions, and small acts of bravery. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think we talked about it earlier when I said that all these women are my heroes. I mean, so many women here are my heroes, and you guys certainly are, which is that to me what's interesting is there is a world to understand social movements and people who are really fighting big challenges in a very loud public way, and I think that's wonderful, and we've seen a lot of scholarship on that, and it's really remarkable. But for me, what's always been very interesting is, we keep saying this in a very glib way, oh, even with the best laws and the best policies, things won't change unless attitudes change, right? How do you change attitudes? What does that actually mean? Changing attitudes is not a marketing campaign. An attitude is not a dress that you wear, and I convince you to buy this dress so, your attitude has changed. You may wear it once and then just take it off, right? And we see this huge gulf between people's private belief, their public beliefs and their private behaviors. And I was interested in understanding, how do you credibly change attitudes? And one thing you'll notice in the book, each woman in the book, through 15 years of negotiation, has somehow managed to change the attitude of at least one person in their immediate milieu and their own. And it's a hard one, long-run process, and I just wanted to document it. And so to me, I call it dal sabzi feminism. This is not the feminism that'll be on magazine covers. It'll never be on Vogue. It'll never be sort of reified in that way. And yet to me, remember, if only 18% of labor income in our country accrues to women, the women who are earning that 18%, that's one of the tiniest minorities in our country. And if it's that 18%, to me, what was interesting is what does the life of that 18% look like? And the book is just giving you one flavor of that. And that's what I call being part of that 18% dal sabzi feminism. It's not glam, it's not sort of out there, but I think it's actually the heart of everyday sustainable social change. And that's my view of social change, and based on scholars that I've read, then I find compelling. And that's what the book is. So dal sabzi feminism to me is just linked to that idea of who is your hero and social change.
I'll just ask one more question. This is from a student who could not come today because of because she was not well, but she was very keen that please ask this. I said, okay. She said women's interests and activities are often taken less seriously. Like men could be obsessed with a cricketer or an actor even, and he'll be the greatest person of all time. But if a woman expresses the same, it's just futile teenage obsession that she should have grown out of her. And she gave me the example of Beatles versus One Direction also while she was discussing this. So Desperately Seeking Shahrukh is essentially a book that gives insight into the lives of women through their thoughts. Of course, it's complemented by data, but the act of portraying the desire of socio-economic independence through their interest, you know.
So, you know, I was telling the two of them earlier, I have a running joke with my agent, and, you know, mashallah, the book's done well. But we always joke, it's a fact, okay, non-fiction, if you actually start to look at who's reading non-fiction in India, it's men. It's largely English reading men. And this book is non-fiction, and it says Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, and it has a particular kind of cover. And into the first 2 months, it was just chronically dismissed. And even till date, I know there are social scientists who think it's like beneath them to read it because they just don't think that it is serious enough. I think slowly over 2 years, we've chipped away at that. But the joke running between me and my agent is this book is an uncle repellent. So, we joke that there's like an uncle-o-meter and you can almost measure it based on, you know, not to toot our own horns, but you can almost measure it based on at least the initial reaction to the book. So I completely, in fact, as I was hearing the question, I mean, it resonates with just 2 years of the experience of promoting the book and the life of the book as well, which is this chronic chicletification of women's interests, right? So women could be interested in a certain kind of music, women could be gushing about a boy band. To me, all of these things are actually ripe for sociological analysis and economic analysis. They tell you something very important about our society. And yet, I can bet you if I wrote Desperately Seeking a Ticket for Mohan Bagan or Desperately Seeking some big cricketer, it would never be dismissed in that way. And, you know, I have a very dear friend who's been very supportive of the book. And he actually said to me, he said, oh, you know, if you just got rid of Shahrukh, it would be much more serious, right? But that would just be inauthentic and dishonest to the approach and to what I wanted to do. And so to me, it was a decision, it was a risky decision that actually we took, which is that we were going to do this. But we are living in a world, and I think the only solution out of that is for women and for you know, people who don't conform to traditional gender binaries to write their own stories about what are their enthusiasms. I think that's the only way, that's the only vision correction that can happen. You will be dismissed and you will be mocked, and there'll be a little bit of like, oh, is this a serious book? And I remember somebody asked me, was this erotic fan fiction? That happened. And I said, no, Abhijit Banerjee is not blurbing a book of erotic fan fiction, which is interesting. Yeah, and it happens. And I think it is, if I were a man and if I wrote a book in service of another kind of fandom, it would be very different. But I think the solution to that is not to complain about it, but to just do the research. So I encourage everyone here who's thinking of a career in research, do the research that actually gives you a sense of, I don't know, it also makes you come alive. It's a question that is alive for you as much as you can within the frameworks of research funding and all of that. Because I think there are many more interesting stories to tell about women huddled together and watching, you know, TV, I don't know, in the middle of Kerala. I'm much more interested in those stories than sort of the big biography of some politician from Kerala. You know, like, to me, that's the really interesting dichotomy of the way we can do nonfiction and social science. And yeah, I hope this book just adds to that body of literature, which I hope many of you will contribute to.
That's lovely. Shall we open? Yeah? Okay. Shreya, can you pass me the mic?
Hi, I'm Ruchira Sen, a teacher at JSJC, the journalism school. Yeah, my question was actually about The One. The One, I think it would be a very different book if The One wanted his story redacted. And he sounds like not a very nice person. So, I mean, how did you manage to negotiate to have that story told? I mean, I'm asking also for very personal reasons because I have ones of my own and I would like them to be okay with the story being told.
Should we collect questions or do you want to just do? Okay, thank you so much. That's such a, Annie Ernaux, who recently won the Nobel, she has this great story where she basically wrote about her lover and she never even bothered to ask him. And if you read Getting Lost, which I highly recommend, please read it. Don't read Simple Passion. Simple Passion is great as well, but Getting Lost is the longer diary entry version of that. Please read it. She basically says, well, I know he's just going to be upset, but to hell with it because it's my story. I'm not a believer of that school of thought. For me, I'll say one thing. I think I don't think the book's texture would change. I don't think it would change that dramatically because if you look at the elite composites, in fact, I almost feel like the shape of our heartbreak and our romantic repetition is very similar. I think what would be missing is the take on Rajput culture in elite cities. That would really be, I do see that, which I think which is actually the reason why I put that story in there. It wasn't because I wanted to share a heartbreak story. It was because I wanted to tell you what modern aristocracy looks like in India. The way that happened, he's actually a very dear friend of mine now through the process of this entire thing. And I think I say this at the end of the book, right? Which is that if you don't think of love as some kind of maximalist, I must extract maximum gains from you and just think of it as something that is a mutual trade of reciprocity. You can find outcomes that are very helpful for all people involved. And I think the chapter is a result of that. He wanted a bunch of things removed, which I had to sort of honor and, do all of that. And so very, very interventionist, and I'm very, very transparent about that in the book. But I think if you have a story of your own, which you really feel you want to share, it should find a way. And I think the problem is, it goes back to that last question we were talking about, which is why don't we have more interior forms of nonfiction and social science? And I think it's actually precisely this story. And I think the way to deal with that is, one, you're being upfront, claiming it as just your story, and then fictionalizing where you can and where you must with honesty. And the second is, find yourself an ex as wonderful as mine, who was very willing to just say it. But I also think he learned a lot about himself through the way I wrote it. And when I have book events, I had a big celebration for the book. After it won its first prize, he was present. And so, yeah, I think things can change if you look at it from that perspective. Where can I meet you halfway in this process, as opposed to just completely seeking the full story in a maximalist position? Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm having my peak fangirl moment right now, so I'm just going to take a second. I've read your book, I've reread your book, and I absolutely love it. And I kept thinking of really elegant questions to ask you, but my brain's really sort of shrunk. And the one thing I do want to ask you, because it kept coming back to me multiple times when I read your book, is that I love that you didn't remove the I from it, and it made it seem so much more authentic when you held up a mirror at various points. I could see myself in your book at so many different points. And the one question I do want to ask you, and I think you just mentioned it, I don't know if I misheard you. You said you'd given a copy to Shahrukh Khan.
Yeah.
So I'm asking you this as a Shahrukh Khan fan. How did he react and what did he say? And has he read it?
Yeah, so Fuzzy, thank you. You're very sweet. For a brief minute, you made me feel like Shah Rukh Khan, so thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah, no, he has the book. I don't know whether he has read all of it. There are bits of it. He wrote a very nice little letter. Parts of it will remain forever private, but parts of it I actually put in. There's a paperback edition for the book, and it has some bits in it. And what was really fascinating about that whole process was, because I've been really struggling with this chicletification of this book, which I have spent 15 years of very serious longitudinal work doing. And I was struggling with that, and I met him, and he almost immediately knew that the book was not about him. And we joked, in fact, this thing about erotic fan fiction, I mentioned it to him, and he was just laughing because he was so amused. And because this is a man who knows the landscape of how the economy works, this did not surprise him at all. And that was really nice. So in the note, he actually said, "Thank you for putting me to good use," because I think he knows that, you know, it was his icon is used in that way. And yeah, the book is in his library. There's some people close to him who read the book, which is, I think, the reason why I was sort of, because you don't get invited up to go give books. Like, that's not the way it works. So I think something must have happened. And I've just been saying this at every event, anytime his name comes up, which is that I'm just so grateful. I mean, he opened up, I think, vistas of research and thinking for me. I don't think I would have ever even gone in the direction of these 15 years or any of this had it not been for him. And, you know, that's just, it's a kind of gratitude. I don't even think I can say I'm grateful. But, you know, I remember, like, the first thing I said to him was thank you. And it just sounded so hollow and empty, right? Because thank you, like, what does that even mean? So I'll hold that for myself, and he knows that. But the thing that I'm also very grateful for is that he really allowed for so many women who don't speak the language of social science, don't speak this hip feminist language that we see on social media, to just talk about themselves and talk about gender in these really revelatory ways. And I think it's his movies, the dialogues, the songs that are sort of allowing for some of that to occur, and a space which allows these women to take a step back. And I say this at the end of the book, you know, when sort of our westernized elites tend to sort of, and I'm certainly one of our westernized elites, but I'm not part of this group that I'm about to describe, which is that our westernized elites tend to look down on Bollywood, and then they'll say that, oh, but you know, these are some mindless songs and mindless things. You see in the book how much so many women use that idiom to think about themselves, to think about their lives. This is very serious. It's serious, but it doesn't take itself seriously, and I think there's a huge joy in that. So it was wonderful, and he is, you know, they say you should never meet your heroes, but if your hero is Shahrukh Khan, you must meet him. And he is the best human being that best stranger I have ever encountered. Yeah, and the book sits with him, and inshallah, I will keep getting little updates on as he's reading it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Uttaran, and I must say I'm a great Shahrukh Khan fan. And I was really waiting for your book from the time it was advertised, and I really loved reading it. So you know, like, I'm not an economist. The economics thing was very interesting, but what was also interesting is the way you have dealt with, you know, how we receive Shahrukh Khan, and you know, his interviews and all the fan culture, which is an interesting area of research. So I just wanted to ask, you know, what has been the response from film scholars, you know, who are also very, they try to be very serious about this. You know, and I saw you got a picture with Jay just now. Yeah, but Jay is different, right? So what kind of responses have you had from film scholars?
How many film students? I think there are some film students here. Oh, they're like sweetly standing there, like. Yeah, I know about, not only film students, but there's a kind of critic writer who is exactly, I know what you mean. It's like self-seriousness has died down, jumped off the self-serious end. No, you know, it's been interesting. The book has been received. There's been nothing but warmth, actually, I've been invited, I was invited to TIS to actually speak in their film. They have a media and film kind of wing. That was the closest I think I was sort of upfront with academics from that space, and that was really, it was just a very warm. I was in conversation with Shilpa Phadke, who also is interested in culture, in feminism in a very different way. But I think anyone who thinks of film in a sociological way has been very receptive to the book. I think where I get irritated sometimes, and I haven't really seen a lot of it, to be honest, but I obsessively check everything. Like, any review, anything anyone says, I check it. Like, my vanity knows no bounds when it comes to this, so I check everything. that sometimes when I get irritated is when people seem to think that the book is a film book or it's a fandom book. Because as you will know, being a scholar in this field, to actually do a serious study of fandom requires something completely different. I mean, this, I sort of dipped into it because, you obviously talk about fandom, and if you think of fandom as a proxy for freedom and purchasing power. But if I really wanted to center a book around fandom, I would write it very differently. I would do the research very differently. I don't even know how. Maybe these three people here and you will know. And that, I think, sometimes happens where people misplace it. But to be honest, I think by now, into 2 years of the book being out, every event, any conversation, it almost always starts with, this is not a book about him, where he's not centered, but he's almost an anchor, and fandom is an anchor to have a different conversation. So fandom is a research vehicle in the book as opposed to being the subject of the book, right? So sometimes I think there's a little bit of misplacement there. But no, in fact, the two communities that I thought would really get very angry with the book, economists and film scholars, actually the reception has been really warm. And there are film scholars who've reviewed the book in places, there are economists who've reviewed the book. And it's been really, and for me, I've been really humbled by the way different people just see things so differently, right? Like you never think about it when you write a book and put the research down in notes. So yeah, that's essentially it. And Jay, I want to take a minute for all of you. Jay Arjun Singh teaches here. And Jay has known about this book for 16 years, since the time that, because I used to obsessively follow his blog in his previous avatar. And we had a conversation together, which I think is up, which a Shahrukh Khan fan club actually hosted for us. And that was really, I told Jay this, it felt like it was coming full circle. And that celebration party where I was saying my ex was there, Jay was there as well. So I think he's very much I think of him, he's thanked in the book, he's very much part of the journey. I've really benefited reading his work, listening to him. So yeah, it's nice to have that kind of community of, and he keeps saying as well, I'm not like the typical, but that's been very helpful, just so that you have, people who will read the book differently. Thanks.
No, okay. I'm Swati. I'm a historian. I really appreciated how in the beginning of the book, the paperback, and I'm only about 120 pages through, so sorry about that. But you also talk about how loneliness is possible and in fact very prevalent even within the security of relationships. So that I thought was interesting. And also this book is a triumph of note-taking. And
Please take notes. This is the one thing, students, take notes.
I am, in fact, working on my first book, and as I was reading it, I could actually see, this is many, many years of notes and going through notes. So that, thank you for that. But I also wanted to ask, again, as someone who's working on their first book, you are a nonfiction author with a day job, and all these caveats about who reads nonfiction, is this a viable book? Would it have been this book if you weren't an author with a day job? And the second question, and again, I haven't finished it, so sorry about that, but so I was thinking about access to birth control. How is that a part of the story? It hasn't been like in the pages that I've read so far, but if you had any thoughts.
Read Gold, you'll reach there. So I won't give it away. So you should just read. There's a chapter called A Girl Called Gold that gets into some of the issues around fertility, abortions, all of that. You'll read it. I think on the author with a day job, to be honest, I don't think I would have ever written this book if it weren't for my day job, because in a way, I think I wrote it almost as rebellion against my day job, because I'm expected to behave a certain way. There's a way these jobs operate. And I'm not just talking about my current job, but just jobs in the past, be it research assistants for professors or think tanks and so on. I think I really just needed a creative outlet because of the nature of that day job. And so that's why I think it ended up being this way. Plus, actually, it's because of my early day jobs that I met some of the women I follow. I just wouldn't even have the material to start with, because the research projects were because of my day job. I think the third reason why the day job allows for the book to occur is because this book was not commissioned. I was doing it on the fly on my own. There are resource implications of following people for 15 years. You have to keep going back. Someone has to pay for tickets. So I was doing that on my own. I'm very grateful to my employers because they gave me an income and that allowed me to cross-subsidize the research for this book because I didn't have a research project. And to be honest, that gave me tremendous freedom as well because as you know, you're then not bound by, you're only bound to your creativity, right? So I actually can't imagine writing this book had it not been for the day job. So I don't even think it would exist. I would then just be the author of, reports that are out there in my name on social protection and jobs and so on. So I'm very grateful actually for the space, the resources, and the connections that these different day jobs seem to have created. But I think in terms of the viability, and one of the things people keep asking me, I'll sort of tack it onto your question is, but do you think this book would find a publisher even if it weren't for Shahrukh? Because I'm not a journalist. I don't come from, there are like networks through which you reach publishers. I met my agent through people, who introduced me to her. And the funny thing I actually now discovered through the course of this book, because I obsessively check sales data as well. I think my publishers are just tired of me asking them. And one of the things that's really interesting is actually, if you're a celebrity yourself who writes a book, people will want to read it. So if Shahrukh Khan wrote a book on Shahrukh Khan, it would sell. If you're a film scholar or you're like a non-celebrity, it's difficult because, that's a very niche audience. And I noticed with this book, it was only when the reviews and podcasts and things really started sort of moving out that you suddenly start to see then sales pick up. So this idea, right, that you'll have a celebrity and then that'll sort of help. It may help with some virality, but remember my book released into this very strange time for Mr. Khan's icon. So there was virality, but of like very dubious nature, where my father literally, I remember once he called me and he said, I think you should publish this book anonymously, like it should just have another name, because it was just horrible, like pictures being morphed and terrible things happening. And so I think in that context, it'll give you virality, but it won't guarantee you readership or engagement. And I think that takes some time. So yeah, I think that's, good luck with your book. I look forward to reading it.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. So my question in very brief, is love the problem? Because like intimacy and independence are confrontational for women in ways that men will never understand. Like how much women have to give up to seek that independence. So is it always an either or situation?
Depends. I mean, if you sort of buy into this idea of very traditional, hetero, like pair bonded, codependent, we'll match outfits together and go to things together, then yeah, I mean, that's like boring. I mean, who would want to sign up to that, honestly? I mean, I'm sure many of you have, good for you. So if you define it in that very narrow way, sure, but love is much broader than that, right? Love can be between friends, it can be between the natural world and yourself. It's an attitude to me of generosity. It is not a contract that I sign with someone saying, you do X, and conditioning on X, I will do Y. This is not a transaction. I think the problem actually is that we've started defining love as a transaction. So men define it as, I will earn status if I'm with a woman who behaves in XYZ ways. And women have started to believe I'll earn security if I start to behave and the man behaves in XYZ ways. I think if we start to remove those notions of love and sort of take a step back and ask yourself, what is that attitude of generosity that'll make you happy? Maybe it is with a sexual relationship or a partner, or it's outside. I don't know. That could look very different for different people. So no, I don't think love is the problem. I think the way we frame love and the way we show up, and I have an entire chapter. I mean, I will encourage you to go read. The last chapter of the book is called Love Area, which is actually precisely about this question you asked us, which is, I think love has become this transactional item. Much like labor, it's become marketized, in this sort of, when we talk about the mating market. But I don't believe that that is what, I mean, in its most genuine sense, if you look at like the romantics, or if you look at literature, or if you look at philosophy, or even the better parts of religion, Love is actually an attitude of open and pure generosity. It's not this hustling for welfare and you do X and I do Y. And I don't think it's impractical actually to return to those ideas of love, especially for those who have the resources to do it. I understand for women who need marriage as almost a social insurance mechanism, that they think of love in these very transactional terms, or men who do so as well. But if you're not bound to that, right, which certainly I think there's a part of our elite that isn't, then ask yourself what's going on. And one of the funny things you'll notice in the book, actually, the people who are really redefining love and really asking very tough questions of that regime, this very totalitarian idea of love, is actually people from the precariat. It's from the emerging middle class. It's all these women who are the first in their families to have a job, speak English. It's actually the elite where there's almost this fear that, oh, you know, if we let go of this idea of love, our notion of status, property, assets, capital will suddenly start to wither away, which might happen. And so I think the answer to your question is it's not love, but it's the way we frame love, and maybe it's time we also took a step back. I think we're all plagued with this disease of loveria, this very like transactional idea of it. And maybe it's time we redress that. If you have the resources in this space, you can. I don't think it's confrontational, independence and intimacy. In fact, to me, they are it should be a healthy balance of the two. Maybe in your 20s it won't feel like it, but I promise you past 35 it will. So yeah, that's as much as I have to say.
You? Okay. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. I'm a very big fan.
God, I'm really feeling like Shahrukh Khan, you guys. Thanks.
I had two questions. I'll be a big opportunist here. One, are you going to write a second book? And second, I saw your stories when Pathan was released. So, how would you write
now I'm embarrassed. Yeah.
Would you write an update to your book about how your following reacted to Pathan, or how the book's following and the people talked about in the book reacted to Pathan?
Thanks. I am right. I am in the middle of research for my next book. It's going to be called The Tyranny of the Indian Uncle. There's a primer of the book that's actually available. It was the closing end of your article for Mint Lounge just in December 2023. It's available. If you just look up Tyranny of the Indian Uncle, you'll find it. But it'll take me time. Like, my work is longitudinal, and so it involves following people. And so it'll take some time. So I'll probably be in my 60s by the time it comes out, like, in all likelihood. The thing about updating the book may be, to be honest, I was a bit tired of this excessive extra commentary on Pathan. I felt like there was just too much. I'm really happy the film is done well. And I went and saw it with a bunch of fan clubs, and it was just fascinating. But I think a lot has been written, and perhaps too much has been analyzed and said. You know, there were op-eds like flying everywhere on Pathan almost like every weekend for a period. So I don't know, can I really add any value to that? I'm not sure. Maybe what I might do, and we'll see, is maybe write a bit more about the fan clubs, because they played such an important role in Pathan doing as well as it did. That might happen, but a bit later, not right now. I want to actually, what I'm very interested in is actually not just Pathan, but to see how this whole year goes, because he has 2 other very big films coming out, and I think actually each one will be bigger than the last. That's my sense. So maybe just an update on just reflecting on the year that's gone by, and also a lot has happened in our economy since the book came out. And so maybe, but not right now. I'm also really tired, and I want to write about uncles right now. And Shahrukh Khan is the anti-uncle. So, you know, it's like I have to figure out how I do this. But thank you for your question. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rana. My name is Ram. Hi. I read the book with interest, not because I'm a Shahrukh fan, and I'm not. So I'm kind of indifferent. I read it with a lot of interest, and, you know, thinking about the stories of these young women, right? And I could not stop thinking about some of the young boys who also face similar type of pressures, right, while they're growing up, and in different type of, absolutely different type. I'm not trying to compare. And would you, if you had been thinking about this more generally, rather than just about, women and their challenges, would it have still made the same impact? Because they also, the young men here in India also face similar type of problems, right? And so if it was not desperately seeking Shahrukh, but if it had been seeking one of the other, female actresses. I don't know who, Madhuri Dixit or somebody like that, right? Would it have
Betraying your generation.
Huh? The new generation? I don't know, because you seem to be. So there are. It's a two-part question. That's one thing there. The second is, even when you are, the later part of the chapter, I think the last part of your chapter, you still refer to the young generation, and you refer to the Singhs and the Khuranas of the world, right? You're still talking about these young male idols rather than female idols, right?
That's not true. There's an entire section about how the next Shahrukh will probably be Deepika or Priyanka. I don't know if you read that part of the book. In fact, one of the things I'm very clear about, and I say this very clearly in the book, is that the next Shahrukh is a woman. There's no denying that at all. And in fact, I say this, there are like paragraphs and paragraphs on this in the book about how it's fascinating to me, in like a slum in Delhi, you have a girl whose mother is a domestic worker, who essentially is obsessed with Priyanka Chopra's Instagram. And she's borrowing her brother's phone just to be able to. And by the way, sir, the reason we focus on women is because men just have the economy. I mean, our economy is masculine. No, all the data shows it. Like, it's not a question of feeling, it's a question of data. And I think, if we are in a world where we're going to pretend that men and women have both issues, we're ignoring the fact that we have a masculine economy. If 18% of labor income is for men, if all the jobs, or in the top 10 fastest growing sectors, only 19% of jobs have accrued to women, we have to call a spade a spade.
That's fine, but that is
no,
fine.
I don't want to argue. I think it's just more a question, and I'll just answer. And I think to me, what was fascinating, I'll just go back to this thing about, so the fact that this young girl has to borrow a phone from her brother just tells you what the shape of this current economy is, right? This goes back to how masculine it is. And I think in that world, she basically, there's a line in the book about how Shahrukh plays out her mother's fantasies of being essentially a benevolent patriarch, someone who'll take care of you. And Priyanka Chopra plays out her fantasies for herself, which is she wants autonomy, she wants achievement, she wants independence. And so I think, in fact, recently the lady who follows me on Instagram can verify, I actually put up a thing saying desperately seeking Priyanka, because I do believe that now the energy that you feel in many of these communities is very much for women superstars, not just, by the way, in film, but also sport and so on. So that's one. And I think as for whether the book would be different if I sort of went in thinking about, well, what are men's challenges? Sure, but that's for someone else to write. I don't particularly think it's as challenging as it is for women. And I think, to be honest, we have to be very careful with that kind of narrative building, because that's precisely the narrative building that leads to this dismissal that we've all been talking about, and so many of the women and men here have been talking about. So we have a crisis of masculinity. The crisis of masculinity is not linked to resources not being available for boys. I think the crisis of masculinity is actually resources being deprived from girls, and boys are also struggling to how to deal with that. So I think that's for someone to take on that book, but that's not my interest or my prerogative.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Mom. I'm Saloni. It's a pleasure having you here. So I actually had two questions. So first one, if I'm not mistaken, in the annexure I had noticed that in the workforce participation rate table, the workforce participation for both male and females has been going down since 1911. So I wanted to understand that even though the population is increasing, so why is that happening?
So a couple of things. So one of the things that's really important is, remember, the gap though between men and women still remains an average of 50%, right? So there's a slight dip for men, and actually in the past 4 years, you've seen both for women and men, there's been an increase. So if you look at the 2021 data, there's been an increase. But what's happening there is, all economists are saying it's stress. It's basically post-demonetization, you're finally seeing, and COVID, you're seeing sort of women's flexible resources going in. What's happening is three things. We have, and I mentioned this in the book, we have a job loss economy. We have an economy which is basically not creating as many jobs. The jobs that are being created are largely cornered by men. There's data on the book that shows that, and there are reasons for that, right? Because jobs in India tend to be clustered in specific areas. To actually be able to follow opportunity, you need to be able to migrate. For many women, if housing markets, and you're smiling because you know exactly what I'm talking about, if housing markets don't work for you, if transport markets are unfair, how are you going
I
to
recently
migrate?
got a job and I'll have to move for that. so-
Exactly, yeah. And I think, one of the things that's interesting that's going on is with the economy, the way it grew between the 1990s till at least the 2015s, there are 4 or 5 families of reasons why you're seeing this very sharp drop. India is the only country in the history of the world where the economy has been growing and yet women's employment has just been plummeting. That just hasn't happened in any other context. Eventually, maybe China, you'll see it happen. Turkey, there's a slight drop, but not the rates that we've seen. And one of the really tragic parts of this is that many families feel that if we have the additional income, we can purchase more conservative values, right? So if we have an additional income, maybe you don't need to work, right? You can stay at home and find like a nice boy who will marry you. That's one. Second is, of course, the actual jobs that are available. And there's fabulous work by people like Ashwini Deshpande. I'd highly encourage you to go read her work, looking at what's happening to the supply of jobs, right? There's also this whole question about the leaky pipeline when it comes to transport, housing, and there's Rohini Pandey and people at Yale who've been doing a lot of really interesting work on that area as well. And the fourth, which is, of course, which is like the elephant in the room, is care. I mean, women barely, we are not only in the bottom 5 of the world when it comes to women's presence in the economy, in the paid economy, we are also in the bottom 5 when it comes to men helping in housework. Right. So you see that that's what's happening. And as for why there are, I mean, I think there's a whole set of structural reasons why you're seeing this like diminishing employment gains, and it is because of the structure of growth itself, right? Where are the jobs going to come from when you're relying largely on certain service-oriented areas, and regulations don't really allow for certain types of jobs that would absorb a lot more labor to occur. And there's a wonderful paper by an economist called Amit Basole looking at the structural transformations in the economy that explain both for across genders what's happening. I'd encourage you to read that as well. But that's broadly his hypothesis, which is it's looking at the sectors of growth. The sectors of growth are just not labor-intensive sectors of growth. So that's what you're largely seeing. But remember, for women, it's like the additional compounded thing of, care plus ancillary markets plus the type of jobs plus the fact that there are norms, right? So all of that seems to be stacked up and you're seeing this drop. Thanks. Good luck with your job.
Thank you. So the second question I had was that given that these days we notice that work from home and paternity leaves is something that offices are offering, we see in today's age that mental awareness is something that we all talk about, be it even men's mental health. And in the modern age, I believe, we are making it more, normalizing the fact that it's good to be vulnerable and emote your emotions even as a guy. So do you think all of these factors and us probably as even women or as a society realizing that, it's not on the men to take over the responsibility of paying the expenses, but it's something that you split the responsibility. So do you think these things are in a way going to help contribute more women entering the workforce?
Well, let's hope so. But I'll tell you what my concern tends to be. There's a woman who I interview in the book and she says, well, now I'm expected to earn the additional income. Plus, he's not helping me with any of the additional roles, right? Even if she has the best house help, she's the one navigating lists. Economists call it the cost of keeping track. You're always keeping track, right? And I can sense there are people grinning here because many people have experience of what I'm talking about, perhaps. So I think given that world, sure, maybe those kinds of shifts and norms are helpful. But people like Professor Deshpande will say even if those norms shift, if there are not enough jobs, we don't have things like affirmative action for women, incentives for better childcare, better transport access, housing, then even those shifts and norms may not actually produce the big shifts in the numbers that you would hope to see. And so while I'm sure one will never sort of debate whether we should have gender change curricula and sort of these kinds of conversations, but I think the really tough question is where will those jobs come from that will absorb women? Where will the housing and tenants come from who let women live on their own safely without having an additional premium, particularly in the north of the country? And the third question, I think, tends to be where will the time poverty be addressed? Because so many of the women you'll follow, I followed a bunch of elite women for almost 7 years. Majority of them dropped out of the paid workforce into their early 30s because they just said once you have kids, and some of them, in fact, even before kids, they just said it's impossible to manage. And the workplace doesn't feel particularly friendly for many of these women. I hope that's not the case for you, and I wish you the best. Thanks.
Hello. I think the minute I read the words, my life has been a heteronormative hell. I was hooked. So thank you for that. So I was having a conversation with an academic today, just today morning. She's had about 25 years of experience researching and doing fieldwork. And I asked her a question. Say I tell you tomorrow that you had to teach economics to a classroom. Assuming you don't have any background, how would you teach it? And she told me that I would get rid of the notion of the classroom in the first place. What I do is I take these students out and I take them to households in India of all social stratas, and I'll make them talk to the women in those households. And you will see how their idea of how economics sort of plays out in the real world. You'll see the change in their mindset almost automatically. So that's my question to you. So if I asked you if you were going to teach a class, and she answered, keeping in mind there were small kids, maybe you could also say if you had to teach economics to middle-aged uncles.
I asked them to read Desperately Seeking Shahrukh. We have a joke. I had a joke with Mr. Khawaja, we should mandate finishing school for certain men. This book should be on the curriculum, along with some major feminist texts as well, which are accessible. I like the idea that your professor, I'm assuming, that she came up with. But to me, I feel like actually the interesting thing is, go back home and just observe who's doing what in your house. Time diaries are very useful ways of thinking about economics of labor, right? Just look at what your mom is doing, look at what your dad is doing, look at what your brother is doing, come up with those time diaries, right? And then sit as classrooms and just discuss what does that mean. You'll learn a lot about incentives. Why did mom spend X number of hours on this? And what was, going back to all these questions about cost benefit and modeling. I actually think things like time diaries and just even forget the world outside. You don't have to go invade someone else's home. You can just go back to your own home and just observe what happens and keep a little record of it. For the book, I asked many of these elite women I was mentioning to her, who opted out of work, eventually paid work in their 30s. I asked them on one Friday to just go and observe, who was doing what. And they came back really mad because I think it took a little bit, because you're so busy in the everyday of your life, right, that you don't realize the imbalance that's going on. And they came back really angry, and I think I may have facilitated some very, very tough conversations in their homes. But it also actually allowed us to have a conversation about time poverty, about labor, about the structure of the economy, right? Which is sort of the fundamentals, at least, of feminist economics. So I would say something like a time diary. Just ask kids to go back and keep a little note, and then you can all talk about who did what with their time and why. And I think that might be interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I really like today's conversation. So my question is, when you were doing your groundwork, you're talking to women, their families about when they were sharing their stories and all of that. How were you well received? Like, were they open to sharing their stories and experiences, or was it how was the environment?
So I have to say, in Shahrukh, when I say, he's my research method, I think I found someone who really just helped open up. Because, right now, there's something very interesting in the social science. We sort of talk about pleasure as a principle of research methods. So if I ask you right now, tell me something that makes you happy or, you enjoy watching. And then we start talking about that. And then we start talking about how you find time to do that and all of that. You and I will have a much more engaged and energized conversation. You'll be perhaps much more happy talking to me, and I'll also not feel like a fool talking to you who's bothering you, right? I think that was broadly what started to happen. At the initial phase of the research, when I said in the beginning, when I just went with my survey questionnaire and just, tell me yes, no, and ticking, that was a bit hairy. It really wasn't working. I think when we started to just lean in a little bit more on the icebreakers, it started to open up. Having said that, one of the things I do mention in the book, and I think it links to this conversation on time poverty we were just having, it was so hard to find time with these women to do the interviews because everyone, and even elite women, I mean, I'm not just talking about women from the precariat or the middle class, it's just impossible to just find the time. There were constant changes, and I can tell you this because I've done research on men. I'm right now doing research on middle-aged men. It is not as hard. When they tell you they'll meet you at 4 o'clock, they'll meet you at 4 o'clock because somehow that is the way, the exigencies of care work and the exigencies of life somehow seem to always knock out women's schedules, and it's really difficult. And that's something I actually get into quite a bit, which is I think there is this, I think the feminization of care really sustains like a feminization of exhaustion. And so I think actually the energy that Shahrukh provided really helped deal with some of that exhaustion, because it was a really exhausting, all these women were really tired. I was tired too, I had a job, and then I was sort of coming back in, and I think it was good to have him to sort of lighten things up and look at things together or laugh and giggle, and I think that really created energy. What was also very hard was going back and doing transcriptions. So I was transcribing, and then I had to go back and share this with people. And it's hard to find time with people, exactly as I mentioned. And it was also hard sometimes to, because people couldn't read, so I had to literally physically go. And the funny thing with that is that, the book would have actually ended in 5 years of research if I had just got the first draft approved from all these women. They all had suggestions for changes, and then as we were discussing the proofs, they started telling me about more things that had happened, and the 5 years became 10 years. So finally, I actually owe that process, just the rigor of that process. So yeah, it was tiring. But I think I'm glad that we had this sort of anchor for energy. And it was really hellish to go back and find time with people just to, go through the transcripts and just get everybody's okay. And then the final part of the research process, I interview a bunch of academics, and and many of them, it wasn't difficult, but it was really funny. So for example, I wrote an email to Professor Jean Drez, and I said, I have this book, it's about Shahrukh Khan and women, and would you and he wrote to me saying, I am not the right person to be writing anything about Bollywood. And I had some experiences like that where people were a bit perplexed and confused, but I think once you explain that to people, people were very generous. I cold called so many people I didn't even know, and they were willing to help because I think they just thought this was an interesting thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
I'm
looking at your,
with your next book that you said that you're writing, what are you going to take a similar approach to?
Yeah, which is what's going to take me. I was telling her it's going to take me 20 years to write it. Like this one took me 15 years. I'm pretty sure the next one's going to take me 20. So yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Hi. So my question was that you started writing this book 10, 15 years back. So I wanted to know that looking back at when you initially started it, have some conversations or some concepts sort of become a little bit outdated because of the general modernization of society and all?
It's funny, it's a great question. The answer, sadly, I think is no. Because, the questions about the fact that your professor here is still talking about how getting a PhD means you will be discriminated against in the mating market. That conversation was happening 15 years ago and continues to happen now, even with the most educated, women. I think what has changed, though, is the way people receive the imagery. So if you look and you see it in the book, it actually evolves. So earlier you have a world where people can barely go to the cinema hall. There's data that shows that 6 out of 10 people in a cinema hall are men. It changes then to phones, to, like the media technologies as they start to change, the mode of engaging and accessing the icon changes as well. But what's really fascinating, and you see it, I don't want to hit people on the head with it, but you'll see it in the book, you'll see that the time changes very slowly, it changes very differently in different places. So in Jharkhand, even now, in a particular part that I follow, 4G is still a very exotic thing. Whereas in Delhi, we're talking about seeing reels of Shahrukh on Instagram, right? And you see this sort of displacement of time in very different places. In terms of concepts, no, because the theory of intra-household bargaining has actually only grown in momentum amongst feminists and economists in the past sort of 10 to 7 years. And the data, in fact, has become worse on women's employment. So that, yeah, you're laughing. You'll see the book. It's really depressing. It's brutal. So no, I don't think in terms of the concepts that was difficult. I think one thing that's really useful is that statistical agencies choose to actually be very open about the way they report labor data. So you can be very transparent in the way it was collected, what it means, and you see it in the annexures. So I think what's really changed over the years is media technology, this idea of how time changes. And amongst the elite, there's this language of, of a certain kind of feminism that you see, which is very different between women and mothers and daughters, which actually is fascinating, and it comes up in the book. But I think to me, that's the one change. So, for example, Shahrukh the Stalker, thinking about those films is a very significant part of his early icon. I won't give it away, you should read the book. I mean, it's there, and you see the way over time, the same woman who enjoyed Dar over 15 years, now suddenly you realize, having your own experiences with being harassed, in the workplace or in public spaces, you suddenly start to feel and get very angry about that kind of icon, like the icon of that, right? And the imagery of that. So you see that shift. So I think it would be sort of much more about bodily autonomy. I think that really has shifted, and you see that, and media technologies. Thanks.
Hi, so my name is Dia, and so when you mentioned how talking about Shahrukh Khan was like a conversation starter for you to talk to these women, and obviously your research started about 15 or 16 years ago, but ever since 2014, and I mean we've kind of always lived in a society that has been Islamophobic, but ever since 2014 it's just come up in the mainstream. So like to a point where Shah Rukh Khan, who was this heartthrob once upon a time,
He's still a heartthrob.
he
darling.
is,
He's 57. Have
but
you
the
seen
hatred,
him? Yeah.
but the hatred that he
No,
gets
I know.
on
I'm kidding. I'm being facetious. Please go on. Yeah,
I
you're making
love
a scene.
Shah
Yeah,
Rukh
I
Khan.
know. Yeah, same.
But the hatred he gets on social media, even before Pathan was coming and all these theories, and then theaters getting thrashed for even showing up this movie. So this mainstream hatred, so like, did you sort of ever see this shift coming? Because yeah, this he was just an anchor for women, and now I think even with a lot of women, he's not just like a heartthrob, he's a Muslim actor. That identity is on the forefront. So
I'll actually be you'll see this in the book. Women across social caste, because there are Muslim women in the book, there are Christian women in the book, there are Hindu women in the book. His religion is never something that they use to describe him. They sort of see him from the prism of sexiness, of success, funny things he says, the things he's doing on screen. He is never reduced by, and by the way, not just fans, there are people in the book who don't like him because there are people in the families who are reacting to the women who are fans. But the reaction comes from the place of conservatism when it comes to women's bodies and fantasies and sexual autonomy. It never, in the way it's articulated, it doesn't come from a place of religion. Now, I think my sense of what we're seeing with this icon, and I've written about this around the time, because actually the book came out, and I was just answering this question for someone. The book came out at a time when a lot of what you're describing, the hate campaign, particularly online, was going on and was very strong. At that time, I remember feeling, because you can sense this, right, with Twitter, when things are also manufactured, right, on social media. And I remember that I'm just knowing that Pathan was going to be this giant hit because A, you were seeing the organized nature of that, and then the reaction to that, because each time there were things that were being said, there were also people who may not be big fans who would then come up and sort of react and try and redact and sort of say this is not what we stand for. And I think he is a kind of India that many people want to believe in, right? And so in the book, you never see religion being this sort of this motivating force for discomfort. It's more sexual autonomy and the body. What does happen, though, is around the time of the NRC protests, there's a young woman in my book who's a young Muslim woman who's very upset that he's not speaking up on behalf of the community when all of this is happening, particularly when it comes to the attacks in Jamia. And she sort of says, well, he went there, why isn't he speaking? But it took her literally 2 minutes, and I mentioned this in the book, it took her 2 minutes to say, and it's something she's very poignant. She said, well, maybe it's difficult for a Muslim hero to speak right now. And she said, maybe this is a time where he's speaking, but he's speaking in his own way. I would like to argue that Pathan is him speaking in his own way, right? And so, yeah, I think that's as much as I have for you. The switch to sort of this aggressive communal sentiment, it's always there, it's lingering through communities. But Shah Rukh Khan doesn't become the focal point of them till I think you start to see this very organized attack around what happened, not just around Pathan, but around a year ago with the shameful things that happened with his son, right? I think that's really when the pitch. But I'll tell you something very funny, which is that I don't know if you remember the story of Lata Mangeshkar's funeral. And he went to the funeral, and he was actually praying, and then this was like Spitgate, like, oh, he's spitting on her. It was just ridiculous, right? Dua Gate, I think some people were calling it. And I remember I spoke to this woman who I was telling you about, who was very upset at him not speaking for the NRC protests. And she said, well, isn't this horrible the way they're attacking him for actually what is just a very common practice in our faith? And I said, yeah, and then we were talking about how there are people also who are coming in to sort of support him and defend him. And, there was that picture of him and his manager that had gone viral then at that time as well. And I said, yeah, he stands for, a secular India. And then she said, हाँ, and I'm quoting her, she said, हाँ, वो secular तो हैं, but वो sexy ज़्यादा हैं. And I think the thing is that I do think that at least for a lot of the women that I interact with, they don't view him, maybe because they are fans, they don't view him from that lens. They view him for a very different way. I imagine if you went and situated these conversations largely with boys and girls who have grown up with that kind of sentiment, you might have heard different things. That's not what you pick up. And I wonder maybe it's also because there's a certain type of person who will become a fan of his. I don't know. And you'll read the book and tell me. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Saloni. I'm a final year law student here.
Good luck.
Yeah. So, ma'am, I had a question. Like, I do realize that, okay, the book is not personally about Shahrukh, but you do mention what kind of a person he is, or in the book, or the relationship with his wife, or something like that.
No, I can't. I mention what people say about his relationship with. I cannot comment on his.
What the people.
I'm too ordinary a fan to write, to analyze him in that way. I can't do it. Yeah.
Like the relationship, like the people's perspective, like you've pointed out at least that. So, ma'am, like I wanted to know, like, did you make Shahrukh like a part, of the writing process, because it was still like focused on him? So did you start with that? And moreover, like, ma'am, like how did you navigate, like maybe like think about it, like even like in the legality perspective, like personality rights and everything, like it was still like he is a huge part of the book. So like how did you like
so I have to thank HarperCollins and Mr. Khan's management, because essentially what happened was that when the book was coming out, we had to send them details very clearly saying this is the book and all of that. They were very supportive, so inshallah. And then after that they were extra supportive when the book went to his house. So that I think, but that is actually a very important point, which is that we had to sort of, you have to, right? Because of, even if his face is on the cover, his name is on the title. And these are very important statutes, and the publishers have lawyers and legal teams that are very well versed in dealing with these kinds of things. So we went through that. In the process, I realized something very funny. The way I used to have notes is that, so for example, I have notes for, these are labor histories, right? These are the history of people's lives. I have notes which are per person, literally per year, what I have. And the way the conversation would be triggered would be like, they'll say, kuch kuch hota hai, and then there'll be a whole set of conversations around that, right? So it was never anchored around him. It was anchored around some of these trigger points that created these conversations, and you'll see it. That's the way it sort of shows up in the book. The only time where I got into sort of putting a compendium together of, things that have been written about him and being a good social scientist is that, they always tell you if you're going to use a research method, describe your research method. So there's a chapter in the book which says, who is Shahrukh? Because what is my research method? And I wanted the reader, particularly a foreign reader, or a reader who's too young, or a reader who doesn't understand sort of the various aspects of his icon, to essentially read it and understand what he signifies, at least in our culture, based on what different people have read. So I went and interviewed critics. So that was actually much easier and straightforward to do, right? When it was actually about him, because people have written so much, and you can interview people, and you can sort of be very clear about it. So yeah, I think that's broadly what I did. But the structure of the notes are actually very much labor histories. So it's, this year this person had this job, this year this person did this to watch this movie. And it's almost titled one by one. If you come to my house, you'll see there's like stacks and stacks of just notes. And each one is just catalog based on years for each person. So that's the way it was done. But no, I cannot write a book on Mr. Khan, because as I said to you earlier, I'm too ordinary a fan. I can't take that analytic distance. It's not possible. So I think what's in the book is, I think the generosity of many people, they were willing to be interviewed. I interviewed people like Anupama Chopra, who's in the book as well, and she was so kind. So I asked them to teach me how to sort of read the icon, because I can't. And then that's there in that particular chapter. Thanks.
Ma'am, but did you ever think about like letting him know that there's a book gonna be written about him?
I just mentioned that, right? Earlier I just said that lawyers had to send the thing to him, and then the book is now at his house.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Google it. It's very interesting.
Hi, my name is Ritik and I'm a final year IR student. So I read your book after listening to your episode with Amit Verma. And so I think, so my question to you is a year after, I think a month and a half ago, he also did an episode with Nikhil Taneja, which is on the loneliness of the Indian man. So I guess my question to you is, how do you, I don't know if you've heard that episode or not, but how do you think that idea per se also interplays and interlinks with the argument that you made in your book?
So I think it actually links to this question this lady just asked about this hustle culture of love, right? So if you believe in this codependent, pair bonded, transaction oriented idea of love, we're all going to be doomed to loneliness. And that's, I think, what our culture is right now. I think it's motivating so much of hate politics, it's motivating so much of so many behaviors, right? So to me, I mean, across whatever gender you may identify yourself with, you're locked into that loneliness if you're locked into that view of what love and what sort of the nature of romantic entanglements or even personal entanglements are. I think it does have a particular shape when it comes to women, which is very different from men. I don't think the economy makes men as lonely as it does women. I don't think the things that you just heard her say, which, I mean, it's going to stay with me for a very long time, which is you just heard a very successful professor say that I was told if I do a PhD, I'm never going to find a good man or someone will not love me. Men are never made to feel unloved if they do well for themselves in the world. They may feel that they can earn more love by doing better for themselves in the world, which again goes back to that very transaction-oriented, this love area that I was talking about. So I think it holds a different shape. I do think that we're living this crisis of masculinity that we were talking about, and I'll have a lot more to say about this in maybe 15 years or 7 years, who knows when I finish. Like all these men that I've been interviewing for my current book, there is this loneliness that they speak of, but it's very different. It's almost feeling like the country's shape when it comes to norms and things that made them feel comfortable have almost been pulled under them. So they look to, icons in our politics or icons elsewhere to try and feel. I mean, there's a very interesting corollary I'm noticing that's happening, right? But it's not the economy that is. I do believe the economy, housing markets hate women in our country. Markets in particular hate single women in our country. I think that creates a kind of loneliness that I don't think men have to contend with. Men have to contend with a very different kind of loneliness. And I have heard Nikhil's episode, which is, what does it mean to be the stoic man, right? And what does it mean to sort of let go of that performance of masculinity, which I do think is fueling so much of what we're seeing. But I think the incentive mechanism is very different and what's being structured is very different. So to me, I actually had a chat with Nikhil Taneja and we did a little conversation which will be up soon. So I'll put that up and you must listen to that because we did talk about this a lot. But thanks for your question. And I hope you're not lonely.
I think we are done taking questions. So just one last question from my side, Shana. I'm taking the benefit of being with you in the dais. If we talk about this, since we're talking about the book, we're talking about desperately seeking Shahrukh Khan. I think Shahrukh has redefined what we expect from men, how he understands women, or at least, the view that we have that he understands women and how courteous he's been. I think at least I'm guilty of trying to look for traces of Shahrukh in my own husband. Okay, there has been instances, and I'm guilty as charged, where I have thought, if just like it's shown in Shahrukh Khan movies, if I'm going through this, why can't this man understand me? Not behave in the way I would expect him to behave. Have you come across certain situations like that where you have tried to look for traces of Shahrukh in men and you've been disappointed?
So listen, I have to be very honest. I say this to so many people. There's Shahrukh Khan and then there's the world of real men. I mean, I don't, and to me, it's these are ossified compartments which to me don't percolate into, because I recognize, it's a set of, one thing you realize in the book is that everybody's creating their own version of who this actor is. Everybody has their own idea because they're picking and choosing bits and pieces of his iconography to almost create this person. And so I think given that world, I see it as an act of almost creativity on behalf of fans. And also, when he keeps saying, I'm a myth of Shahrukh Khan, I'm an employee of the myth of Shahrukh Khan, I always say I think I'm a co-stakeholder. I think anyone who's a fan is a stakeholder in that myth, which has created, but I think so many of us have co-created that with him. So if you're conscious of that, I don't look for him when I meet real people. And I think I'll also unburden, I love him so much that I will unburden him from looking for him when I even meet him. Do you know, like I think that sort of larger than life ideas is I think he's an icon. That's a constructed, constellation of things. I think that's unfair to expect of real people. And yeah, I think that's something I'm very cognizant of, particularly I think through the research in the book. And plus there's no one as sexy. I mean, good luck, fine. Like, who are you going to find like that?
I completely agree. Okay, thank you so much, Shreyana.
Thank you, thanks everyone. Thank you. This is late, so I really appreciate all of you sticking around. Thank you.
I think one of the most interactive sessions I've had in Jindal. It's true.
No, thanks to the two of you. And again, thank you for being patient with my health and with everything. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who helped organize all of this. Gentleman who's been behind the camera and all of that. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll just felicitate you with some goodies from Jindal. Yeah, I'll just get it because... There's a nice scarf, I think. Oh, I don't do it. Yeah, this is it.
This is customized. Oh my goodness, this is so, I feel like I'm in Hogwarts.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Come.
I'm looking like some strange person holding it. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to read more from you, I'm sure. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know it's the Good Friday weekend, but a lot of you took out time, so thank you so much. I think some of you want to get a book signed. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. If you could just line up. Can we just do a little... Hang on.
This is from the professor who was sitting on the floor.
You have to just make sure by 6:20 I have to.
Yeah. Hi. My name is Akshara, and honestly, I haven't read the book yet. But the moment I got to know, I just ordered it that moment itself, and I tried to finish it in a day, but it wasn't.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, so I'm actually looking forward to making more.
I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. No, it's fine. Oh my God, what is this? Okay,
I'll take notes.
Swati, you said, right?
Thank you.
Good luck.
It's Yashodhara. I teach film actually in the liberal arts school, and thank you so much. I mean, the book was fantastic, informative, and I love the way that you combined it with one of my greatest fears of all time, math. Seriously, it was great. And never a Shahrukh fan, but the man has aged like fine wine.
I know.
Thank you so much. It was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
It's my second copy because I've been gifting everybody.
You're very sweet. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Unfortunately, my books in my office.
Don't worry. Remind me your name?
I'm Mahim.
M-A-H-I-M-E.
You are just brilliant. I read your book the first time when I was in the UK, and I reread it recently, and it just gets better every time. Could I also ask you for another favor? Do you mind writing one out to Rushi? Because she's deeply debated you.
Dear
Rushi, R-U-S-H-I.
was a wonderful session.
So how is the law treating you?
It's good. Actually, the book was suggested by a professor of
Go on.
mine, Akansha Kumar. Yeah. She. Thank you.
Thank you, Saloni. Good luck.
Thank you so much for this book and this discussion. So I teach law here. I teach a subject called law male, and I ask the students to come here and really.
So is the law male?
Of course it is. Big Shahrukh Khan fan, so totally Shahrukh.
I'm a label of profession.
Yeah,
The
she's
students
my label of
voluntarily
professor.
come here, so
Oh,
goodness.
So we have a label of submission tonight at 10.
Oh God, okay. What is your name?
Varsha.
Spell that for me.
Barsa.